The following is an HDNet original presentation.
The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised. Tonight, on a special Dan Rather Reports, Voices from Mexico. The drug war is raging, the body count is soaring, and success south of the border seems even more elusive than ever. In the next hour, Dan Rather talks to those living the war, what should be done, and why the United States needs to take this crisis even more seriously.
Good evening from Mexico City. More than 34,000 Mexicans have been killed in this country as part of the U.S.-backed war against drug traffickers. And the drug cartels have now expanded their reach from beyond the borders into almost all parts of the country, even some here in the center, Mexico City. We came here to get the pulse of the drug war and found a sense that what is being tried now isn't working. Anxiety is high, and many are saying that it's time for a radical rethink. Tonight, we will examine this crisis in depth and from several perspectives, hearing from those struggling to understand and forge policy on the front lines. The United States and Mexico have a long, uneasy relationship rooted in disputes over territory, immigration, and the trafficking of arms and illegal drugs across the border. But the 2006 election of Mexican President Felipe Calderón signaled a new cooperation. President Calderón immediately deployed his nation's military against the drug gangs that in recent years had grown into vicious criminal organizations. And the United States offered the Mexican president unprecedented support in the form of arms, intelligence, and training. To date, Washington has pledged $1.4 billion to Mexico's drug war. But while the United States was publicly backing the Mexican efforts in private, there were grave concerns. Internal cables from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, released by WikiLeaks, painted the Mexican military as disorganized and not up to the job. It was an embarrassment to President Calderón and his counter-narcotic strategy. Then, in early 2011, a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer was killed while stationed in Mexico by suspected drug traffickers. President Calderón rushed to Washington in March to meet with President Obama and made a strong public case for maintaining the U.S.-Mexican partnership.
The United States and Mexico are walking towards an uncertain future together, and the more we cooperate, the more we can build secure and prosperous lives for our peoples, both sides of the border.
We arrived in Mexico shortly after that speech and found that some of President Calderón's former supporters were losing patience with his policies.
It is easier to get a good Secretary of State on it.
Dr. Jorge Castañeda is one of Mexico's best-known public thinkers. He served as foreign minister for the last Mexican president, Vicente Fox, and he campaigned tirelessly for Calderón in an extremely tight presidential race. But since then, Dr. Castañeda has become one of Calderón's toughest critics, primarily of the president's war on drug trafficking. And he thinks now is the time to do away with the war on drugs with a radical new policy.
I'm totally in favor of legalization of drugs in general and marijuana in particular.
You know, there are people who are watching, listening to this and say, ooh, Dan Rather's interviewing a very radical guy down there in Mexico. He's got all these radical proposals. Do you see them that way?
Well, legalization of drugs doesn't seem to me to be a terribly radical proposal. 47% of the people of California voted for it in terms of marijuana just 4 months ago. Republican conservative like George Shultz and mega financiers like George Soros are in favor of it.
But that's for marijuana, not for the hard drug. Yes.
No, we can start with marijuana. Even the U.S. Embassy here says that they estimate, and the DEA uses this estimate, it may be a little exaggerated, that 60% of the profits of the Mexican cartels come from marijuana. Let's say it's not 50, let's say it's 40. Solving 40% of any problem these days is not bad.
What do you make of the proposals to say, listen, what we need to do is cut the production of marijuana? There was a time when Mexico was a transit place, but now a lot of marijuana is grown here. They're going to farmers and say, instead of growing marijuana, we'll help you plant an orchard or something.
Well, if that had worked somewhere in the world, then I would be, quite willing to consider it here. Alternative crop programs in Bolivia, in Peru, in Afghanistan have not worked. And they haven't worked for the past 40, 50 years. Why? Because you'll never give a peasant the rent, the extraordinary rent on growing illegal drugs by growing, tulips. It's not going to happen.
How can you get at, how can Mexico get at the drug organizations, or can they?
I don't really know how they can. I'm not sure that's possible. I'm not sure it's necessarily desirable in the sense that if it's not possible, what you want to do is set yourself goals that you can achieve. Now, what is it, if you look at the polls and you ask Mexicans, are they worried about drug trafficking? No. Are they worried about drug consumption in Mexico? No. Are they worried about kidnapping, violence? Yes. Okay, so what you want to do is attack those aspects of the violence and insecurity, the collateral damages. You want to stop kidnapping. You want to stop extortion, protection rackets, which are really terribly damaging to small, mid-sized communities. You want to stop automobile theft. You want to stop homes being held up. That's what people are worried about in this country. Now, when someone says, well, it's the drug traffickers who do that, well, go after the kidnapper. If he happens to be a drug trafficker also, great, you got a twofer. Fine.
Well, both President Bush and President Obama have supported the, quote, war on drugs in Mexico.
They have and they haven't. In other words, they have in the sense that they have been very generous in their rhetorical support, both Bush and Obama, for President Calderon. Every time they see him, they pat him on the back and they say, you're doing great, you're brave, courageous, bold, etc. Neither President Bush nor Obama have really done anything about either U.S. consumption or U.S. arms exports to Mexico. So it's obvious that American society doesn't want to reduce consumption. It feels it's doing just fine the way it is. So why in the world would American presidents declare a war on drugs in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York or Birmingham or anywhere else? They don't want to. What's incomprehensible to me is why we should do it if Americans don't want to. And by the way, I insist, I agree Americans shouldn't. But go after the kidnapper. Let the other guys, I wouldn't say allow them to do what they do, but understand that you're not going to stop it. What is the U.S., what are U.S. armed forces, 130,000 of them, doing with poppy growers and heroin labs in Afghanistan? They're looking the other way because they have another battle to wage against the Taliban. So why should we act differently?
List for me 1, 2, 3, your top 3 things you think the United States could be doing and should be doing to help the situation in Mexico, particularly directed toward the violence brought on by the drug trade.
Well, if I may, I try and turn it around. In the sense, I think the best thing the United States could do for all of these problems to be eventually solved is to contribute actively to building a more modern, more democratic, more prosperous, more secure Mexico. And that has a lot of implications. It's not just police work. It is more trade. It means dealing with the immigration question and settling the issue of 6 to 7 million Mexicans illegally in the United States. Give them legal status, let them work, let them become residents, let them eventually become American citizens, and allow for more Mexicans to enter the United States, but not illegally, legally. The only way to solve the issue of illegal immigration is to make it legal, not to stop it. It's not going to stop. It never has. It's been going on for more than a century. It's not going to stop. contribute more to the type of supranational institutions with Canada that the Europeans have built over the past 50 years.
You're talking about Canada, United States, Mexico,
Common
much
market,
improved common market, trade zone.
Absolutely. A common external tariff, some institutions, social cohesion funds, etc. Americans say, well, yeah, we're not in the business of spending money for other countries. We don't like that. Like Iraq? How much has the U.S. spent in Iraq the last 8 years?
Trillions of dollars.
10 billion, 5 billion a year in Mexico makes all the difference in the world. It's peanuts compared to Iraq or Afghanistan, and this is enormously more important for the United States than Iraq or Afghanistan.
Why do you think a succession of United States presidents have paid so little attention to Mexico?
Because they take Mexico for granted, and they've been right. In other words, the U.S. should count its blessings, because not only has it had a neighbor at peace with the United States, it has had a neighbor at peace with itself since 1920, let's say, when the revolution ended, 1917 if you prefer. This is quite a luxury. Ask the French, ask India, ask the Chinese, ask the Germans. And this is quite a luxury. So that's one good reason. Another good reason that Americans tend to take Mexico for granted is that Mexico is a very hospitable place for Americans. 1 million Americans live here the whole year round. 20 million Americans visit Mexico every year, not just crossing the border, spending at least a night somewhere in the interior. It's an enormous amount of people. There's no incidents worth mentioning.
I want to talk about the WikiLeaks case. WikiLeaks published these cables from U.S. diplomats, and they described the Mexican military as disorganized and incompetent in its war on drug trafficking. It was pretty critical all the way around in the WikiLeaks. How accurate is the assessment? Whether one likes the fact it was leaked or not, how accurate is it?
Well, just a tiny little bit of context. Mexico put together its current army back in the late 20s, early 30s. And ever since then, it was purposefully kept in a state of limited resources, limited training, limited capability. I mean, we really nickeled and dimed them in every sense of the word, in every aspect of military activity. And we did that deliberately, as a policy, as a national, long-standing policy. Why? Because we didn't want them to even think of trying to take power. And in a region, Latin America, where armies take power or took power all the time,
with coups and
coups all the time. Central America, South America, democratic countries like Chile, like Uruguay, undemocratic countries, the works. This was a very intelligent, very far-sighted, very visionary policy that the Mexican system, in its wisdom, adopted back in the 30s. Then you take these guys and you tell them overnight, okay guys, now we got to go to war. Time to fight.
Wasn't an army constituted to go to war?
Of course not. It's constituted for natural disasters, for earthquakes and stuff. They just tell them, okay guys, now we go to war. There's these guys out there, they have machine guns, they have surface-to-air missiles, they have automatic weapons, they're well-trained, they're desperate, they're ruthless. Go and get them, guys. They have no idea how to do this. Now, maybe that previous decision was wrong. Or maybe it became wrong, it became obsolescent with time. That may be. But what you can't do, I think, is take that army and overnight send it to war.
In your opinion, based on your experience and knowledge of the country, where will Mexico be 10 years from now? Will it still have this savage drug business?
I don't think so, for two reasons. First, because I think the next government will back off from this. President Calderon can't anymore, but I think the next government, whoever it is, will back off one way or another, explicitly or discreetly, tacitly. This can't go on.
You mean go more toward law enforcement rather than military war?
More law enforcement, less army, more tolerance, less obsession, more silence, less grandstanding, less stridency, firstly. Secondly, I think that Mexico 10 years from now will be a very prosperous country. you look at the change in Mexico over the past 10 years and just extrapolate that same change for the next 10 years, this will be a prosperous, democratic, middle-class society where millions of foreigners come and live, where Mexicans find good jobs, higher-paying jobs, with stable institutions, and maybe where one of the economic activities that people have here is growing and exporting marijuana to the United States.
Doctor, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. It's an honor.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
When we return on our program, a look at the U.S. role in the escalating violence.
The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
The epicenter of the drug violence in Mexico is the city of Juarez, just across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. Juarez isn't only the most violent place in Mexico, but it's also one of the most violent cities in the entire world. Last year alone, the city of 1.5 million had more than 3,000 drug-related homicides.
The United States can do a lot on its side of the border to help the Mexican people overcome this very difficult moment.
John Ackerman is a respected voice in the Mexican legal community, whose writings about Mexican government and politics are regularly carried in the Mexican and U.S. press. He believes that the violence in his home country has as much to do with what's going on north of the border, in the USA.
So the Mexican government has successfully reduced, for instance, the territory over which the different groups are fighting. So they start to fight even more over a more limited territory. This is why Juarez is the most violent place in Mexico, right? Juarez is so violent because it is the strategic place for the entrance of drugs into the United States. Okay?
And guns coming the other way?
And guns come through wherever, but Ciudad Juarez happens to be the place where the drugs go across the border. And so the Mexican government has put pressure on those transit routes, and that's created too fighting between the narcos. Now, the Mexican government says that this is indication that the Mexican drug cartels are weaker, right? That they're somehow fighting between each other in a fragmented way, and there's an indication of success. I don't see that. I don't see any hard evidence of success in the war. What I see is an increase of violence because of this territorial military strategy.
Is it a war on drugs?
Both the Mexican and the U.S. government have tried to sideline the idea that it's a war, but in practice, it's still being carried out as if it were a war. Mexico is militarized. We have over 50,000 troops in the streets with military checkpoints, violations of human rights right and left. This is not something that would be tolerated in the United States. Imagine a military checkpoint on I-95. That wouldn't go very nicely with the U.S. population.
Well, whether you call it a war or a movement or an effort, is it something that President Calderon can win?
I think the Mexican people can win it. Calderon's on his way out. There's federal elections next year. Calderon...
He only served one term.
He only served one term. There's no re-election. It's been 6 years. Calderon's not going to win it. That's pretty clear. He's leaving in a year and a half. The Mexican people, I think, can win it, but it depends on a little bit more creative leadership by the United States and relationship between the United States and Mexico. It seems to me that Obama and the U.S. Congress is distracted by issues in the Middle East, which are a very important distraction and a very important priority. But we have a very serious situation in Mexico, and the U.S. political establishment has not paid serious and enough attention to what's happening in Mexico.
Do you or do you not consider Mexico teetering on the brink of becoming a failed state?
I don't think so. I mean, the Mexican institutions are strong, abstractly speaking. We have a very large budget. We have oil in Mexico. There are an important amount of police and military. The problem is that isn't that we don't have a state in Mexico. The problem is that that state which exists is not doing its job. And so that's a different situation, because the idea of a failed state is the idea of a country that doesn't have a state and is basically in anarchy and chaos. While Mexico does have these institutions, the problem is making them work.
Do you not consider it teetering on the brink of becoming a narco state?
Well, that's a good question. The big question I have is to what extent the narcos are already inside the government. Right? The inheritance of the governments run by the Party of the Institutional Revolution, which is the party which was in power for 71 years until 2000, the inheritance of that government, it's pretty well recognized, has been one of alliances between the narcos and the government. Now, the sitting government, Calderon government and the Fox administration previously has changed the situation. Unfortunately, there isn't clear evidence that they have made a really aggressive anti-corruption push. So the suspicion is that the narcos are still inside the state itself. So it's not a question of whether the Mexican government is going to turn into a narco state. It's a question of whether the Mexican government will be successful in pushing out those elements of the narcos who are still sort of left in there from the previous administration and continue to be ratified today.
You know that a widespread attitude in the States is, listen, we keep pouring money into Mexico and things just get worse. It's a corrupt, violent place, and it's pretty much a lost cause. What's your reaction to that?
There's a lot the United States can do which doesn't necessarily imply money. Right? So let's stop the guns going down to Mexico. 90% of the weapons used in these killings come from United States gun shops. Recently, the Agency on Tobacco and Firearms issued a request for an emergency resolution which would require gun shops in the southwestern part of the United States to report, only report, multiple purchases by the same person at the same gun shop of assault weapons. Just to report, just so that we can have a little bit better of a law enforcement strategy to stop these guns from going to bloodthirsty drug cartels in Mexico. The NRA and some politicians stopped that and, well, pressured to stop it, and Obama, this is an administrative executive decision, and the Obama administration refused to move forward on this request by a member of the very same Obama administration. Now, this is not even talking about the right to bear arms. This is just basic information requirements which allow for a law enforcement strategy. So to me, this is an obvious way in which the United States could support the Mexican people without necessarily increasing funding.
Doctor, one of the things we try to do in our program is give some context.
Sure.
And to deal as best we can in some depth.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a situation here where in Washington, and it's not new with this administration, it's tended to say, well, Mexico's a problem because it sends all these drugs north. Here, President Calderon, and fairly recently, once again said, listen, a big problem for us is the guns going south. Sure. Is this or is it not a case of don't blame me, blame the other guy? And what can we do about that?
I think it's true that both Mexico and the United States are responsible for this problem. Right? It would be incorrect and unfair for the Mexicans to blame the Americans, or for the Americans just to blame the Mexicans. We need to have a joint strategy. Calderon is right that the United States should control the flow of arms and money south, reduce drug consumption, and the U.S. government, public opinion is right that the Mexican authorities need to confront that problem of corruption. This is something that Calderon has not made important forward steps on in the last 4 or 5 years. So there are serious problems on both sides. We need to avoid this kind of name-calling and really sit down and think of creative new strategies to resolve this problem.
Well, with this spike in violence, which you mentioned, violence is up, it's increasing. Is that, in your judgment and opinion and based on your experience, because of increased drug activity or the aggressive, militaristic response by President Calderon?
I think it's a result of the mistaken way in which Calderon and the U.S. government has been looking at the problem in Mexico. Basically, it's been, again, looking at the issues as if it were a war, a battle for territories. And Mexican public opinion is starting to change. In the beginning, the majority of the people supported Calderon's strategy, and now, every day, he's starting to lose support. And he's losing support because the amount of dead is going up year by year. We now have 35,000 violent assassinations in the last 4 years, and people are convinced that something is wrong with the strategy. It doesn't necessarily mean that confrontation with the drug cartels needs to end, but it does mean that something different has to happen. And I think the United States has an important responsibility in this.
Just ahead on our program, in the trenches with the reporter who is dug deep inside Mexico's shadowy criminal underworld. You'll want to hear what he has to say.
The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
4 years ago, we reported from what was then the heart of the drug war, the dusty towns along Mexico's border with Texas. At the time, it looked like things couldn't get much worse. We headed to Nuevo Laredo shortly after dawn, to a place where the U.S. State Department warns Americans to exercise extreme caution because of the brutal drug violence that has become almost routine. Our guide was a journalist who didn't want us to use his name because he has to live here after we leave. On the highway to the entrance of the city is a shrine to the fearsome-looking Santa de Muerte, or Saint Death. Lit cigarettes and beer are left in hopes that favors will be granted and protection offered. If the cartel members have a god, this is it.
It's what, 7:33 in the morning? Well, why are we coming in so early?
It's better if you take the work early in the morning. Sometimes at night time, it's hard to do this kind of activities because the problem in Nuevo Laredo.
Problem being people shoot things.
Yeah, it's dangerous to be at night.
Perhaps no people in Mexico have been harder hit than the folks who live here. So far this year, 170 people have been killed in drug-related violence. 2 men from Laredo shot and killed. 2 men shot in broad daylight, driving down a main street. This man shot at the front door of his house. This man killed as he got off the bus. You don't have to be here very long or be much of a reporter to see what the problem is. This house tells a lot about it. Bullet holes in the garage, bullet holes up here. This is a pretty good Nuevo Laredo neighborhood. But what happened was the drug traffickers, in their fierce battles for supremacy, sometimes erupt into battles that encompass whole neighborhoods. It did with this one. About a week before we got here, 45 minutes of automatic weapons fire, at least 4 people killed. Virtually this whole part of the city was silent and listened in fear as the big drug lords' armies fought it out. Perhaps you're wondering what the police are doing to stop the violence that has threatened to shut down their bustling border town.
The police force in Nuevo Laredo I've seen gradually weakened over the past couple of years.
Mariano Castillo is a reporter who covers Nuevo Laredo and the border for the San Antonio Express.
For a long time, there's been problems with local police who were on the take with the Gulf Cartel. And that eventually led, about 2 years ago, to a giant gun battle between local police and federal police.
It also led to things getting so bad, the federal police stayed to patrol the streets afterward last year.
The result of that was a huge clampdown where all 800 officers in Nuevo Laredo were kind of put on hold, all their backgrounds checked. And as a result, half of the police force either quit or was fired.
And now there are even fewer. This is part of Nuevo Laredo's police station. About 160 police officers for the entire city. They're, of course, targets, prime targets for the drug cartels. This year alone, more than a dozen police officers have been killed. They are outmanned and outgunned, and they know it. Since our first report, the death toll has kept climbing, and at an increasingly faster rate. The sprawling capital, Mexico City, hasn't suffered the kind of violence plaguing Mexican cities along the U.S. border, but it is the base of operations for President Calderon's war on drug trafficking and home to the architects, experts, and observers of the controversial strategy.
Well, the security seems pretty tight here. We've been approached, 4 or 5 times since we got here.
Certainly. I mean,
We spoke to one of those observers, British journalist Jon Grillo, who writes for Time magazine and is finishing a book on drug cartels called El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. We met him outside a detention center where some of the world's most feared drug kingpins have been held while awaiting trial.
Well, where are we?
This is a place where they get highly dangerous criminals, the criminals considered a threat, dangerous, and they hold them for up to 3 months before they are decided if they're going to charge them and put them in a regular prison or release them.
When Grillo moved to Mexico about 10 years ago, the big story was the end of Mexico's 70 years of single-party rule. But the excitement about Latin America's newest democracy was soon replaced by the escalating violent drug war.
You've been covering Mexico for over a decade.
Yep.
How has it changed here?
Mexico was very optimistic then. It was just got rid of one party who had ruled Mexico for 71 years, almost like a dictatorship, known as the perfect dictatorship. And that party had gone from power and people were very optimistic and happy, a bit like people are celebrating in Egypt right now, looking forward to this brave new democracy. Now we're seeing real pessimism and attempts to reflect, what has gone wrong, what has happened to this country, why is these big dreams of a great democracy and free market, where have they gone sour?
A key question, to what extent, there's no question they have, but to what extent have these drug cartels, these thuggy, murderous gangs, infiltrated the Mexican government and Mexican institutions?
I think if you look back at the years of one-party rule, there's always been a relationship between government institutions and organised crime. A lot of them, like I say, are former policemen. There's always been very much a link between the police community and the organised crime community. One of the key differences, say, back in the day, was that the government was on top. The government could knock the gangsters into line. Now the gangsters threaten and intimidate, often the time, police and officials, whereas before police and officials could intimidate them.
So before democracy came, it was always a struggle, but the government was on top. Now what you're telling me, in the new days of freedom, which is much to celebrate for Mexico and Mexicans in that, the drug cartels more or less are on top.
Nowadays, often, policemen are being kidnapped. Those same policemen are being kidnapped, being tortured, being shot, unless they take a bribe. So now it's very often the gangsters got the upper hand in that deal now.
Well, describe for me the major gangs now, and what gang is dominant, if any.
In Mexico, you have at least 7 major drug cartels. That's one of the reasons it's so complicated to deal with this situation. Whereas in Colombia, you talked about having 2 major drug cartels, the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel. Here you have 7. So whereas in Colombia, you have the idea of cartel decapitation. You bring down a boss, in the case of Colombia, Pablo Escobar. Here you bring down the head of 1 cartel, 2 cartels, 3 cartels, you have 4 other strong cartels who start fighting for their territory. But right now, the historically oldest cartel and still the biggest players are the Sinaloa cartel, or the most high-profile member of the Sinaloa cartel is Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Now, Chapo Guzman, it's hard to really know how powerful he is. There's a lot of myths around him, like he exists. You see old photos of him, you hear songs about him. Where is he? We don't really know. How many people does he really have on his payroll? We don't know. Forbes magazine put him at the value of $1 billion, 1.00 billion. How did they get that number? I don't know. I don't think it's an exact science, which the Mexican government was very offended by. But at the same time, I mean, this guy is a symbolic, very, very powerful figure symbolically, and his cartels are very powerful.
Let me ask you something I've heard, and based on your experience, I'm going to ask you whether it's true or not. That the United States trains some Mexican army members in U.S. infantry tactics, take them to special training in the States. They come back, hopefully stay in the Mexican army and help the Mexican army. And what I hear is drug cartels use their money to siphon off some of those people. Say, listen, what's your army pay? We'll quadruple it if you come and teach us what the Americans have taught you. Is that true?
In Mexico, there's a lot of Mexican military, Mexican special forces who now work directly for the cartels. They've defected from the military and become gangsters. There certainly has been a lot of training of Mexican military. Among some of that training and some of the kind of manuals that have been used to train them have been exposed, have been declassified. They've been trained in anti-insurgency techniques. There have been some controversial elements of their training which could involve torture as well. It's very hard to pin down exactly which guys were trained and which guys are working inside the cartels now.
Well, do you feel safe interviewing these killers?
Well, I think anyone covering the Mexican drug violence right now can't be dismissive of the dangers. And one has to try and protect themselves in as many ways as they can. One thing, if you look at a lot of the assassinations on Mexican journalists, they've often been for very concrete reasons. They accuse politicians, they accuse networks of corruptions, they put names and addresses. Now, one thing I try and do, I'm not interested, if I interview someone in the criminal justice, I'm not interested in putting the names and addresses where people work. I'm not interested in putting corruption networks. I'm not interested in putting any exposure of things which could damage the overall organization. I'm trying to understand from a human point of view what makes these people tick. So I'm very careful not to try and upset or put any information which could damage these organizations for my own safety. At the same time, like I say, anybody right now covering this in Mexico cannot be dismissive about the level of violence, you know.
Well, just yesterday, saw in one of the local tabloids here in Mexico City, front page splash of an assassination, and I said to myself, this is good for the cartels. It's advertisement. You fool with us, and this is what can happen to you.
Exactly right. So the cartels want stuff in the papers. Now, these guys say sometimes they'll plan a murder with the news bulletins. Like, they'll know there's a news, 10 o'clock there's going to be a news bulletin on the TV. So like 8 o'clock they'll put out a body which they know is going to make the 10 o'clock news. They plan it. They put car bombs and so forth. They want media exposure for these. So now there's a big debate here where the president has said, please don't cover so much violence. It's giving us a bad name and you're helping the cartels. But then sometimes these newspapers are in between a rock and a hard place where they'll sometimes get someone phoning them up saying, if you don't put this in tomorrow's paper, there's going to be a problem for you guys. So they want to dictate to the media. Now, for the media, it's very, very hard. What do? I've got somebody phoning up saying, if I don't run this, I'm dead. I've got somebody else phoning up saying, if I do run it, I'm dead. How can I operate in this environment?
Well, the record shows that Mexico is probably the most dangerous place in the world for a working journalist, even more so than Iraq or Afghanistan.
It's very sad what's happened to Mexican journalists. While they've been exercising their freedom, they've been under a very sustained attack. And the Mexican government hasn't been able or hasn't had the real will to protect them. I would really lift up my hat to Mexican journalists. They've done an excellent job in exposing corruption, exposing drug violence, exposing all of the intricacies of what's been happening here the last few years. A lot of what's in the American newspapers and the American books comes first from Mexican reporters digging it up. And I think, although Mexico's seen some very sad things in terms of corrupt politicians and poor policing the last few years, journalists are a general institution, I would say, have been a success in a democracy.
Coming up next, the story of one woman who has dared to expose some of Mexico's most dangerous secrets.
is the worst street in all the place. This. Inside there, there is the most big place where sending drugs, all kind of drugs. My name is Ana Hernandez, and I am a journalist for 18 years.
Annabelle Hernandez is the very definition of guts. While other journalists like Yon Grillo try to explain Mexico, she goes after the bad guys. And she has risked it all by just publishing a book exposing the ties between the drug lords and members of Mexico's elite. Everyone from prominent government officials and military leaders to titans of the business world. One of Mexico's most notorious drug lords, El Chapo, graces the cover.
This investigation, it was very hard to do because first, I'm a woman. And in Mexico, the policemen and the generals and all these people, including the drug lords, they don't want to talk with a woman. That is a world of men. And just the woman is used for their pleasures or that kind of things, like a wife or like a girlfriend or like a mistress, but they don't used to talk with a journalist that is a woman. So that was very hard. And second, it was very hard because the issue is very dangerous in Mexico, you know, and nobody wants to tell you the truth. Nobody wants to tell you some things that can put in risk their own business. So it was very hard to do it. Una colonia, un barrio.
Since daring to publish the book, her life has taken a terrifying turn. She now needs armed bodyguards 24/7. To protect her safety, Hernandez asked we not show their faces or the faces of her family.
The bodyguards are policemen. They work for the government of Mexico City. They are with me all the day. When I'm inside my home, they are outside. They sleep outside in their cars. That is not what I want. I try to live the most normal that I can. I always know that it's dangerous. I can't say that I didn't know it. Of course I know it. I know perfectly that a journalist can be killed. There are 61 journalists killed in Mexico in the last 10 years. So it's a truth. But I believe that we have to fight for our freedom, for the freedom to talk, for the freedom to denounce the corruption. That's what I still do.
La verdad es que uno vive de las historias.
And though journalists are being murdered by the dozens, Hernandez insists on putting her name on all of her books and articles.
Last week, I were in a meeting of journalists, just talking about what's the dangers to write about the narcotraffic. And most of them said that they don't want to sign their reports, or they don't want to write about that anymore because it's so dangerous. And I say that that's not okay. I'm not afraid about drug lords because everybody knows that they exist. Everybody knows their face, their names, where they live.
It's the businessmen and government officials who have the most at stake and will do anything to keep their ties to the cartels secret. She learned this the hard way after she followed up on a tip from cartel sources. They told her about a top-level law enforcement official on the tape.
I have to ask to myself, how can I prove it? I don't have a photograph, I don't have a video. How can I prove it? So I start to investigate his properties. And what I find is that all he has, houses, properties, doesn't correspond to his salary. So where's the money come from?
Hernandez says that revelation has led to death threats, not from the drug lords, but from that high-level government official.
I think the worst part of all this, is because today my family have to have bodyguards too. My mother told me, stop now. Don't do that anymore. Don't say that anymore. But I can't stop because I really believe what is my responsibility to be a journalist in Mexico now. I have a daughter that she's 14 years old. I have a little baby that is 1.5 years old just. I try to go to the park with them to play. I'm go to my daughter to the guitar class, you know. I want to try to be normal because I can't let that these people play with my life. I won't let them.
Her book will soon be translated into English and published in the U.S. She's hopeful it will raise concerns about the cartel's deadly reach.
I think what is happening in Mexico is not just our problem, you know? If I'm telling you that the big gangs, the drug cartels, Mexican cartels, are in the United States, that means that is your problem too. And you have to do it. So you have to do that. You have to do something about it. It's not just how many people are dying in Mexico. It's about too how many people can die in the United States too.
That is on the minds of policymakers in Washington, who, with President Calderon's consent, recently began flying drones over Mexico to track the cartels. The U.S. and Mexico seem determined to keep ramping up the war on drug trafficking. But the human and political cost may prove too much for whoever takes Calderon's seat when his presidential term ends next year. We'll be watching.
And that's our program for tonight. From Mexico City, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.
The following is an HDNet original presentation.
The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised. Tonight on a special Dan Rather Reports, Voices from Mexico. The drug war is raging, the body count is soaring, and success south of the border seems even more elusive than ever. In the next hour, Dan Rather talks to those living the war, what should be done, and why the United States needs to take this crisis even more seriously.
It is easier to get a good Secretary of State on a...
Dr. Jorge Castañeda is one of Mexico's best-known public thinkers. He served as foreign minister for the last Mexican president, Vicente Fox, and he campaigned tirelessly for Calderón in an extremely tight presidential race. But since then, Dr. Castañeda has become one of Calderón's toughest critics, primarily of the president's war on drug trafficking. And he thinks now is the time to do away with the war on drugs with a radical new policy.
I'm totally in favor of legalization of drugs in general and marijuana in particular.
You know, the people who are watching, listeners, will say, ooh, Dan Rather's interviewing a very radical guy down there in Mexico. He's got all these radical proposals. Do you see them that way?
Well, legalization of drugs doesn't seem to me to be a terribly radical proposal. 47
relationship rooted in disputes over territory, immigration, and the trafficking of arms and illegal drugs across the border. But the 2006 election of Mexican President Felipe Calderón signaled a new cooperation. President Calderón immediately deployed his nation's military against the drug gangs that in recent years had grown into vicious criminal organizations. And the United States offered the Mexican president unprecedented support in the form of arms, intelligence, and training. To date, Washington has pledged $1.4 billion to Mexico's drug war. But while the United States was publicly backing the Mexican efforts in private, there were grave concerns. Internal cables from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City
Good evening from Mexico City. More than 34,000 Mexicans have been killed in this country as part of the U.S.-backed war against drug traffickers. And the drug cartels have now expanded their reach from beyond the borders into almost all parts of the country, even some here in the center, Mexico City.
We came here to get the pulse of the drug war and found a sense that what is being tried now isn't working. Anxiety is high, and many are saying that it's time for a radical rethink. Tonight, we will examine this crisis in depth and from several perspectives, hearing from those struggling to understand and forge policy on the front lines. The United States and Mexico have a long, uneasy, released by WikiLeaks, painted the Mexican military as disorganized and not up to the job. It was an embarrassment to President Calderón and his counter-narcotic strategy. Then, in early 2011, a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer was killed while stationed in Mexico by suspected drug traffickers. President Calderón rushed to Washington in March to meet with President Obama and made a strong public case for maintaining the U.S.-Mexican partnership.
The United States and Mexico are walking towards an uncertain future together, and the more we cooperate, the more we can build secure and prosperous lives for our peoples, both sides of the border.
We arrived in Mexico shortly after that speech and found that some of President Calderón's former supporters were losing patience with his policies.